that around the question of islanding, which I think we'd like to unpack. But if I may then just segue across to you, Shahil, very quickly, if you could, look, without disclosing anything that is confidential, but Engie is quite involved in a number of projects, Nascent, in South Africa at the moment. Can you talk to a little bit about that in the context of the scene that Thomas has just set?
Thanks, Matt. Currently, Engie has a unique positioning and value proposition from its expertise in renewable energy, its business model, its R&D capabilities, and its focus on partnerships. And that's made us look at the hydrogen sector in South Africa as something that we would like to explore and something that we would like to unlock to its full potential. So in South Africa itself, we are currently involved, and we are producing green hydrogen at the NewGen plant, which we call Project Rhino, with Anglo American. This is producing green hydrogen to power a mining truck, which is being used for the mining activities at the Mogalakwena mine. We're also involved with several other partnerships within the country, especially with Saldanha, to develop the first green iron ore corridor between South Africa and the EU. So this aims to decarbonize elements of shipping and the mining sector, as well as the Saldanha IDZ.
So if you could just embroider on that a little, because many won't understand necessarily what you mean by green corridor. Are you talking about the decarbonization of the transportation of iron ore?
So with regards to the commodities market, I think that as time goes by and as the decarbonization targets of the EU and other places around the world come up on us, we need to look at how do we decarbonize both the transportation, the production, and all other elements of that are involved in creating this iron ore and other minerals as well. So this initiative itself, it's called the Green Iron Ore Corridor. So we're looking specifically at the shipping, but this can be expanded as we see the need for the country and for the IDZ itself.
So that could be everything in the value chain, from the actual production of the mining of the ore to the transportation of that from, say, Sishen to down to Saldanha. And we'll chat to Kashif in a second about the opportunities in Saldanha Bay, and then the transportation of that ore from Saldanha to its various markets on green powered ships, if I can put it that way.
Ideally, that's exactly what we would love to do.
Yeah.
And I think that's what's needed for the country and the world.
Yeah, okay. If I could then just quickly touch across to you, Ugur. Shahil has mentioned very briefly, this green corridor, so to speak, but the export of product to the EU is becoming more and more of a challenge. And I know that Stahl is mostly involved in the health and safety aspects of hydrogen, but also perhaps you can also give some insight onto what those challenges are. In particular, the directives coming out of the EU regarding the import of ammonia, for example, and what it needs to comply with. Sorry, I'm afraid you're talking into the ether, Ugur.
So, can you hear me? Okay, sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah, from at first, of course, the handling with hydrogen is very, very important, of course, with our to shipping to work with hydrogen or the handling. And I see an example in growing the market, example in hydrogen, in the market of potential of key players in the transition to a more sustainable and low carbon energy system. And I see here is very important to declare the safety in these applications. And you should see that the fire explosion hazards. Hydrogen example is highly flammable and can ignite readily in the presence of air, oxygen, or other oxidation agents. It can also explode if released and ignite in an enclosed space. Therefore, it is important to handle and store hydrogen safely and avoid the risk of the fire or explosions. And we as a Stahl, we can offer more different solution for the different customer, different applications for X atmosphere and hazardous atmosphere, and for projecting, for training, and to work with the customer in deep together.
Yeah, I guess if one wants a real live example of how dangerous hydrogen is, you just have to look at the Hindenburg. But fortunately, we're kind of past that sort of thing. But we would obviously expect, and I guess that the EU is going to be highly regulatory in these respects regarding the health and safety, or particularly the safety aspects on hydrogen import and, well, not just production, but import and handling. But if I can just then also touch base with you, Kashifa, on the export side, if you could give us some insights into what advantages IDZs, I mean, you're from the Saldanha IDZ, but I guess you can speak on an almost generic basis for the advantages of having hydrogen produced and exported from an industrial development zone.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Three things are top of mind. One is SEZs are in essence export hubs. That is the job that they have to do. It's about manufacturing and exporting the goods and services that are produced in those. And also historically, where our SEZs are placed are also quite in and or around ports. So inland, I mean, you've got OR Tambo, which is close to OR Tambo, the airport. But all the other SEZs are largely close to operational ports. So I mean that's a direct benefit that you have industrial location right next to an export hub place. Secondly, I think is that the manufacturing, the equipment manufacturing potential and the benefits that the SEZ can offer through its SEZ framework of incentives and programs and the work that we have created in the SEZ program to create that enabling environment to attract the value chain, because we are starting this is an emerging market for many people. Green hydrogen, obviously South Africa has a long legacy of producing hydrogen at scale, but the locations are new, and I think that's also kind of, maybe if we go there, like this interesting democratization of where energy is and where such a key fuel for the future is being created potentially. I think that's also an interesting conversation. And then lastly, the benefit is that the SEZ operators are geared, I mean, it's in their essence, is to be welcoming to investment and also acknowledging the challenges that investors, local and international, face in investing in South Africa. And we play a key coordination role between all the role players to actually understand what are the roadblocks, and also I want to say, not just like on the negative side, but on the positive side, what are the opportunities that we can put into our economy, into our ecosystem, to actually make sure that the investment does happen and it reaches the full benefit that we all want to see for South Africa. So okay. I think those three for me are the top.
Yeah, but without wanting to put you on the spot, and I'm going to try not to, because you're speaking from an IDZ perspective, but the export of product requires a very deft interface with the port operator. And we're talking about National Ports Authority in this particular instance. And so what kind of measures are you taking to kind of partner with Transnet, National Ports Authority, to be able to make sure that there isn't this kind of blockage or potential blockage? I'm not saying that there is no export facility yet, But what are the kind of conversations that you're having with Transnet to be able to make sure that once this product is produced and ready for export, that it's kind of seamless?
Yeah. So that goes down to port master planning, port planning. And that is a very active space that we're involved in together with our project developers, together with key institutions and role players like the CSIR and the research that they've undertaken, and also from a national coordinating perspective through Infrastructure South Africa and the Office of the Presidency. So I want to give a practical example of where we are working with the Port Authority to understand what is the requirements that we all on the public sector side have to do to support what the business opportunity is. So the Office of the Presidency has, in partnership and commissioned a study that is being undertaken by the World Bank in partnership with CSIR, and I'm going to forget if I forget everybody involved. But essentially, they're doing a pre-feasibility study to establish what is the storage, production, and export potential of the green fuels, so like ammonia, methanol, from the Port of Saldanha and the Port of Boegoebaai. And TNPA is one of the stakeholders and will also be getting that reporting, and they are part of the stakeholder group that is being consulted and being, so there's a feedback loop. So the outcomes of that study will inform decision makers as to what are the trajectories of the business opportunity, and then how does port planning, SEZ planning, and I want to say that actually the bigger question is the public infrastructure aspect, like water, energy, roads, all of these things, workforce. That would help it.
Yeah, so Shahil mentioned briefly the Mogalakwena project, and I mean that's such a cool project because from a water perspective, and noting that obviously Saldanha Bay is a water challenged, not starved, but challenged area, that Mogalakwena is such a cool project because one's using mine wastewater there for the production of hydrogen. Forgive me, I'm just going to mention this. We're great at planning and not so great at execution. So from your lips to God's ears regarding the port plans, because I mean, for example, we know that LNG import has been on the port plan since 2003, but we're no closer to any import infrastructure. So let's hope that there is a proper facilitation. But if I can come back to you then, Thomas, on this point, because and I don't want to ask you to disclose anything around the pre-fees studies that you're doing, because obviously those will be confidential. But to come back to that thumb in the page that I mentioned earlier about the production of green hydrogen, one is aware that, for example, the EU is absolutely insistent that the hydrogen that is imported is absolutely green. So, for example, the energy that is used to produce that hydrogen has to come from a renewable, demonstrably come from a renewable energy source and not mixed with anything else. So can you talk to us a little bit about the Eskom or the DMRE preference around islanding and how that fits into this picture? Because I mean, that's a key consideration for anybody who's wanting to get involved in this industry and export to a jurisdiction like the EU to make sure that it is produced from a completely green resource.
At a technical level, there is nothing wrong with islanding. Everything is nice and self-contained, and what we
Sorry,
mean by
I'm going to interrupt you. Can you explain to the dumb lawyers like me about what islanding is?
And when you island, it operates in an islanded grid. No electrons cross the boundary. So everything is inside the project. The energy that you need to make the hydrogen you generate inside the project, and no electricity leaks into the grid, you could say. So that way, if there is a very clear wall between your electrical system and the national grid, then it's easy to prove. The downside to this, however, is that you will produce hydrogen at a particular cost. There are three elements to making hydrogen. You need water. You discussed the element of desalination. Unfortunately, the desalination of water is a near negligible cost area, and we can come back to that particular point. The second area, the electricity must be green, which means solar and wind. The third area is you need an electrolyzer. The electrolyzer takes the electrical energy, passes it through the water to separate out the molecules. Now, the capex, the electrolyzer is a high capex unit. To make green hydrogen at lower cost, you want that capex to be well utilized. You want the electrolyzer to run many hours of the year. And how you do that is oversizing your renewables. You produce more wind and more solar than you need. Now, this only works if you can find a market for that excess electricity. If there's no market for that, then you are just generating more capex, but no particular benefit. Now, to return to the islanded grid concept, that's not particularly different to the rest of the world. Our competition being Chile, Australia, and so on, generally speaking, have got electrical grids which are
robust.
Yes. And where the supply and the demand are balanced. Let's put it that way. South Africa has problems, as we know, but it's also an interesting opportunity, because if we are now producing excess electricity and we have a system that wants the excess electricity, you can sell that excess electricity. And up until relatively recently, that was not possible. Legislation was that you could only sell electricity into the grid as a result of the IRP, as a result of competitive bidding under the REIPP program, or under a ministerial determination. Since the 100 megawatt cap was lifted and the electricity is allowed to be wheeled over the grid, at least at a philosophical concept, it is now perfectly possible to sell this renewable electricity to a customer in good financial standing who will sign a long-term PPA. What this does is that the generation of a hydrogen economy may even allow the benefit of the grid in our coastal provinces. We know that the grid is saturated in the Northern Cape. We know that it's close to saturated in the Western Cape. So if as part of the stimulating of the green hydrogen economy, we had other actors from Eskom, like say provinces or metros, who were prepared to invest in short portions of the electrical grid and investing in additional electrical substations, that then becomes nodes around which renewable hydrogen producers can develop, and the provinces will get a return on that investment in terms of job creation, in industrial development, and so on. And these can be built on a build, operate, transfer model, so that Eskom obviously must in the end be sole operator of the electrical grid, but they don't have to build every portion of the electrical grid. Eskom has quite a few problems they're dealing with at the moment, and strengthening the grid in far-flung provinces is probably not very high on their agenda currently. And that's precisely what we need to get the hydrogen system going. Returning to with the difference between islanded and connected grid, this actually makes an interesting opportunity for South Africa. It means that if you sell that excess hydrogen, the excess electricity into the grid, you can generate your hydrogen more cheaply than other competing markets that may have better solar and wind. So the difficulty we face with our grid is actually a strategic asset, an advantage, which can allow us then to get long-term offtake agreements. I hope that makes sense.
No, it certainly does make sense. And I'll just ask if anybody has any questions around that, please put those into the Q&A. But if I may just touch base with you on this point, Shahil, knowing that Engie is critically involved in the development of renewable energy projects around the Southern Africa region. How are you dealing with this challenge about, as Thomas has said, having to oversize the generator to be able to ensure that the electrolyzer and the desalinator are always going to be operating, and of course, if you're producing ammonia, the the hydrogen conversion into ammonia, that particular part of the kit, that you've always got electrical energy that has to be green. You've always got that on standby. But if you're oversizing, you've got this excess. How are you as ENGIE approaching this?
So the approach with a lot of the markets that we are working in already is that they do have much more liberal markets where there's a merchant market. Now, a merchant market is where we can sell this excess electricity to the grid. So generally, that would be the best way that we would approach this. In a lot of countries that we are working as well, there is a bit of a difference in the makeup of the grid where there's quite a bit of renewable penetration as well. In South Africa itself, I think we are looking at a lot of different projects. And as I mentioned, some of the partnerships that we have, like the one with Soldana, we are looking at the entire value chain on what are we going to do with these extra electrons instead of just decarbonizing the shipping route, as we talked about earlier. Let's decarbonize the onshore portion of this, or provide this to the municipalities which are close by, or any off-taker which requires it. So there are different solutions, and we are looking at all of these across the world in different forms.
Yeah,
and I think with South Africa itself, yeah, that's what's going to follow.
Okay, but I mean, just listening to what Thomas is saying, and obviously, you know, kind of calling out the elephant that is everybody knows is in the room, and that is, you know, grid capacity and the challenges that we have around that. I mean, are you looking at developing privately or in conjunction with Eskom a privately sponsored or financed grid to be able to export your electrons from where your generators are to where you need them?
So I think within the South African context, I don't think having these islanded projects make a lot of sense. And I think there is going to be some sort of agreement that we'll have to come up with Eskom to either pass the assets on or sell it to Eskom. I think right now the feasibility studies are looking at this, and none of the feasibility studies that I have seen have looked at a pure islanded solution within the South African context.
Okay, well, that's really interesting. And if I can then just cut across to you again, Ugur, on the basis of, you know, what we're dealing with, and you have mentioned is a highly volatile substance, and that, you know, the health and safety aspects around dealing with such a hazardous material are absolutely key. Is there anything in the regulatory framework that we presently have in South Africa that you as Stahl would like to see either strengthened or changed that could facilitate this? Clearly what is anticipated as a very important resource.
I think at first, if you have some new applications, example, at first, the health risks, it's important to see the side, the environmental hazard and the storage of transportation combined of everything. I think for the hydrogen market, it is very important to declare this at first with example, this direction of Stahl or this direction of safety when you handle the hydrogen as it is or ammonia or methanol. And I think that it is first things that you declare the first steps for the implemented applications.
Yeah, and just picking up on that, then, Kashifa, is this a particular area of concern for the industrial development zones, or what sort of initiatives are the IDZs following to make sure that, you know, what is ever developed within the IDZ is completely safe?
Yeah, I think we're going to have to be guided by regulations and processes. I mean, we've got NEMA, we've got project developers have to do, I mean, have to seek environmental authorizations, and they have to go through a process where illicit activity. And I mean, that is, I want to say that in my experience, in my view, that process is ironclad about identifying what the risks are, giving project developers an opportunity to assess and how to mitigate and how to respond to the concerns, public engagement, and feedback. I think that is going to have to be implicit. I mean, that is implicit in the way that we work with the project developers. It's like, okay, so your project is going to need an EIA, looking just at the headline activities you want to do. And we can help facilitate your project development team, your environmental authorization practitioner meeting with the authorities. But, that is a clear
process.
I want to say, there's clarity on the roles and responsibilities, and also opportunities for input. So, I mean, I think that's a good, well-known space. But I think what is coming up in our work with project developers and the local authority is, okay, so then the question of the municipal bylaws and the municipal, because if you think of like disaster management regulations, they, depending on the municipalities and the levels and whatnot, the municipality has a role to play in disaster management, fire stations and all of that, and the district municipality. So in these new areas where this new economy is going to be, how are we making sure that the other role players, the sub-national role players, are capacitated with the understanding of what green hydrogen is and its all its derivatives, of its handling, of its production, and the business case, and the environmental and the safety case. And then is the system lastly, but they're going to have to be capacitated, and there's going to have to be an element of public investment in new resources for the district, for the local authorities.
And that one is well understands, because as you say, then the local authorities do need to be capacitated from this perspective. And I mean, one is aware in other sectors, I mean, just dealing with gas pipelines, for example, how critical it is to engage with the municipality and its fire protection services to make sure that one gets the correct sign-offs. And the question that I wanted to ask you more pertinently in this regard is, do you see your role as kind of holding the developer's hand in walking them through this process, or do you kind of say, well, it's up to you to find out and do?
I think we have to. I think that's the job that we have. I mean, before green hydrogen came,
Yes.
And whether it's an international or South African company or partnerships or JVs, I mean, it's quite clear if you look at like trends nationally in investment and trade and investment tracking. Walking that journey is so important to build the relationship and the trust and the understanding of like what it is that the country is expecting of you at the national and the subnational level as an investor, and what you can put forward. I just wanted to say, like, just a thought sprung to mind now when we were talking about all the SHEC and all of that, and the capacitation of the local authority. So that is actually also one thing that we are facilitating. Yes. So working, because there's a lot of programs on the way, and from the HISA and from programs like under the GIZ framework. So there is scope with all of these programs under the green hydrogen kind of banner, where you can ask, so okay, so you're promoting green hydrogen, but do you have a course that we can take the local authorities through, the relevant town planners, the disaster management managers, about like what to expect, and green hydrogen 101, and then going deeper with like maybe the National Cleaner Production Center that sits in CSIR, to say, okay, so how does your system actually vet building plans or pipeline submissions or anything like that, or like what is the standard operating procedure if there is a fire, or that kind of thing.
So
we are facilitate. We're at the beginning stages of it.
Yeah. So I mean that deals with kind of the interaction with authorities that may be interested and affected. But without mentioning the war, and certainly not naming any names or embarrassing anybody, but how involved are the IDZs in interfacing the developer with local communities to make sure that there's proper consultation? Because we know that that's becoming the real key topic when you're dealing with environmental authorization, is to what extent have the local communities and other interested affected parties, either directly or indirectly, have been engaged with on a reasonable and prudent but proper basis. How involved are you with that?
Sorry, I was on mute. I think we're very involved. The challenge is, I think in South Africa, and like you said, we're good at, we have very good planning methodologies, and we have not fulfilled and followed through on execution as well as we should as a country now, I'm saying. So for us who is in the thick of it, it really becomes a very kind of responsibility question of you have project developers who are working on a thing that you know can change the fabric of that society and economy, and that there are, things that are going to have to be addressed and discussed.
Yes.
It's not all rosy. But then when do you have that discussion when the business case is still being established? You don't, and also you might still have regulatory reforms coming to place that and studies being done that change things. So that is a constant discussion that we're having. So what we do is we work with the project developers, we introduce project developers to the officials, and so that they understand that this is a project that is on a journey, and ask questions, exchange information that is not proprietary or due to a confidentiality clause. Because also you can't give the information to officials and tell them, but you can't tell anybody else, because that is exactly what their role is, right? That's their job. So you don't want to set them up in that, thinking like, what am I getting involved in? And this sounds dubious, like we don't want that in South Africa. So, and then when then we discuss what is the point where we actually have like public consultations. And I want to say that the public consultation element needs to come through a regulated process so that everybody is clear on what their rights are and what their responsibilities are. It can't just be a PR exercise, because then who do you hold accountable after you've had the town hall?
So I guess the regulated process is the environmental legislation framework. But Thomas, you've got your hand up, and I wanted to circle back to you anyway, because I wanted to ask you, in the feasibility studies, and without again disclosing confidential information, to what extent are those feasibility studies concentrating on the very issues we've just been talking about?
I wanted to just mention that Kashif had raised an exceptionally important question. And there has been some prior work in this in the Eastern Cape provincial government, where Alistair McMaster has done some prior work. He sits within that provincial government department and identified, not even talking about hydrogen, just talking about green electricity production. You have a social psychology that kicks in, where you have public service officials who are honest, hardworking people. They're just trying to do their job. They watch TV like the rest of us. They see what happens with the Zondo Commission. They are terrified of making a mistake. And when you're in an area that you don't fully understand, that you don't understand the consequences, and you don't fully, and no one has really explained to you what the various implications are, the logical consequences that you do nothing. And that then means projects don't progress and there is delay. And that gives frustration on all sides. And then you think it is and I don't mean to be unkind, people tend to ascribe this to incompetence, and that may not be fair. It might just be just normal, very rational fear, are not really understanding what is required. So he has taken, this is now Alistair McMaster, an interesting process of designing a long flowchart where all the different steps, approvals that need to be taken are available in visible form. And this is then processed through these officials to go and say, you sit here. The decisions that you influence are in this domain. If there's a blockage here, this affects something here, and X billion rand worth of investment, and so many people have their jobs and whatever. And while it may look scary, your role is to approve this according to this authority which is delegated to you, which requires you evaluating these areas. It demystifies the approval process and then gets greater buy-in at the public sector. And I think something similar to this is required further down the value chain with hydrogen production as well. So it really begins at a discussion which is held with municipal authorities, provincial authorities, and all the various entities in that chain, where you are allowed to ask questions. No one is going to question your bona fides or your competence. We are all learning in this together. It's a new industry, and by creating this freedom to ask questions, we will all move further faster. Otherwise, there's a conspiracy of silence, and then things don't move.
So let me ask you the question, though. I mean, you raise a really important point, which is obviously building on what Kashifa was saying. But so if there's a capacity issue, and then an ability or skills issue, are there organizations there who are actually actively driving this capacity building, so that the officials who are charged with having to deal with these very complex and socially pregnant issues have the confidence, let alone the skill, but the confidence to be able to deal with it on an informed basis, and also on a basis that say, you know what, I've applied my mind, and if somebody wants to take me on review to a court, like seems to be happening on a regular basis, at least that I'm the proposition that I've put forward, or the reasoning I put forward, is defensible. So are there those organizations who are actually helping build these kinds of capacities? Because without that, it seems to me that we can plan till we're blue in the face on this wonderful industry, but we're going to fall at the first hurdle.
I think there are some. I don't think that there is enough. And I think that this is something we need to engage with more robustly. Kashifa mentioned the NCPC. The National Cleaner Production Center is a hosted program at CSIR. They report directly to the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition, and they are resourced by them. Their mandate, up until quite recently, was to enable industry to become more resource efficient, energy efficient, circular economy, management of waste, and their mandate has now been augmented by green hydrogen. One of the things which they do, besides organizing audits of energy audits in companies, is creating and generating skills development activities. These are not in competition with SAQA authorities, the South African Qualifications Authority. It's not competing with universities, technicons, TVET colleges. What it does do is provide in-service training at institutions where, from the artisan right through to the CEO, get to understand this thing called the green hydrogen economy. But I don't believe we have the equivalent for the public sector as yet. I stand to be corrected, but it is certainly worth exploring more.
Then if we can just take it from a little step further, Shoaib, if I can just ask you this. So we talked about the question of partnerships, and in this particular context, the partnership of organizations building capacity within the authorities to be able to deal with these thorny issues. But I mean, how important are the partnerships, or are they important? Are partnerships important in the development of a hydrogen or green hydrogen project? It strikes me that this can't be done simply by one organization on its own.
Partnerships are definitely key to enabling and unlocking the value that we require at scale. And ENGIE is very much looking at these partnerships as very important, especially in the South African context. I've mentioned quite a few times the Green Iron Ore Corridor, but we are working on another project called Rainbow, which we are working with companies, big companies in South Africa, such as Anglo American, Total, Sasol. And by looking at these problems together, that's how we are going to find the solution. The climate crisis is not going to go away. Yeah. And the green hydrogen economy is something that we believe will play a part in alleviating the problems of climate change. And
okay. Sorry, I'm interrupting you. Well, I was going to ask you, and forgive me, but as you were talking, I was just thinking about this question of partnerships and also the issue around capacity building. And you've mentioned, obviously, the big main players in the industry who are obviously going to and need to lead the charge in development of this nascent industry. But is there any space for, the smaller, Black-owned type company to be able to be involved in projects of this nature, even if it's from the ground up? Question of skills and knowledge and capacity immediately spring to mind, but also financial standing and ability to be able to participate. Can space be made for the smaller player?
I think there's definitely space for players across the board in the hydrogen industry. I think if you have to look at the successful programs in South Africa, like the renewable energy, the REAP program, there has been a lot of success stories coming out of that. And some of the developers there, such as the Prisca project, is from somebody who's been a big investor in the renewable energy program, and they've come up from the bottom up and created a program which is going to create hydrogen ammonia for use both locally and internationally. So we already have these examples within the country. I think the possibility of green hydrogen means that there will be place for the smaller players and the bigger players. On a localized scale, once we get to that point where it makes sense, you may have these local companies doing this in rural KZN or Eastern Cape, but there still is space for us looking at these massive projects using the IDZs to send these over internationally. I think we need to also talk about the skills that we've built up with these other programs and how important these are going to be with building the infrastructure at the scales that we require. I think we've touched on the electrical infrastructure in terms of like the grid and the renewable energy projects, solar, wind. You have all these construction companies there. They currently are building these projects on the ground. They are going to be the ones who are going to be building this. So there definitely is enough space for everyone here.
That's well understood. And I think that certainly opportunities lie in the energy production side, the electrical energy production side for the smaller player. Can I just ask you though, I mean, we have been kind of mentioning the big pumper projects like Boegoebaai and the green ammonia project in Coega. What's been your experience in the more sort of catalytic hydrogen projects, the kind of smaller for local consumption? Because there is a question in the Q&A, and I'm anticipating the Q&A, which we'll get to in a second. But the question is, besides export of H2 in the form of ammonia, obviously, because that's the most practical way of exporting, can green hydrogen be produced to be commercially used locally?
As a large international company, we generally are looking at the bigger projects, but on a personal side, I've obviously come across some projects. I came across a project in Durban where they have basically taken an engine and make this run on hydrogen. You take a 500 milliliter water bottle and just plug it in, you can drive to Johannesburg. So I think there's a lot of innovation and a lot of these tinkering projects which we are looking at. Of course, these don't make the press, but they are out there.
And they don't get the funding.
Yeah, I think
that's a bit of a challenge. And there's nobody really on the panel that can answer that question. We ideally would have had a lender on the panel to be able to challenge there. But it just seems to me that the catalytic projects have some real challenges around, access to funding, because there's some, as you say, that project in Durban is such a cool project, but my goodness me, to make it sustainable, it needs financial support.
I think on that, it's the same as how do you fund a 200 megawatt wind farm compared to putting up a solar panel on your roof. It's, the funding gap is there, but there are players in the market who are willing to take this up. And I think having a good strategy on the government level, which is there which is there and is being developed further, I think this is what's going to unlock this hydrogen value chain, as you say, especially on the smaller end.
So maybe we need a small hydrogen program. Kashipa, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I was going to add from the financing side. So what we are learning and seeing from our project developers is that there's this financing requires offtake. And offtake agreements, everyone is in this kind of like, it's an interesting discourse, because some countries or some off-takers or some funders say, like, don't bring me a pilot project because they want the bigger scale. But the big scale is so hairy to do and it's long, right? And there's complexities. And so I think it is a bit of a, you got to find a partner that understands your context. And we will help facilitate that, as all the SEZs do.
Okay.
But because other benefit that we have is that we can aggregate the demand and say, like, you need to maybe start looking at this region, because there are 5 or 6 project developers who, if you aggregate them, you can unlock this socioeconomic value, right? So can you start dealing with these 5 or 6 project developers and really build a relationship with them? Some of them might be pilots, some of them, but a pilot is for something that will grow, I think that when it comes to financing, I think just me being more pragmatic, I think we do have to, we have to show proof of concept, and that becomes something that's palatable and where the risk is better known. And that's, I want to say that we can do in a year, right? So that's a pilot project. So
if I'm, so I beg your pardon, I'm interrupting you. If I could just ask you this, okay? So I mean, aren't the big projects themselves pilot projects? Because nothing has been done at this scale here yet.
Yeah.
So I'm just interested to understand the kind of interface and cooperation between, for example, projects which may be cited and developed in Saldanha, as opposed to, or in connection with, or in competition with, a major project a couple of 100 kilometers north of you at Bucharest.
So, I mean, I can talk about it. So, because it was published, and so Sasol have signed an MOU with the Northern Cape government to advance and their interests in Boegoebaasberg, right, as a producer there and of green hydrogen and derivatives. They've also signed with us an MOU to a green hydrogen project in Saldanha, and they've also signed a joint development agreement with ArcelorMittal, because essentially, on simplicity, is Sasol will produce the molecule and it will be offtake into ArcelorMittal to restart the steel mill. and then
Okay.
produce green iron, green steel, on that basis. That's all are quite clear that they have actually, they see, if you look at their strategies and their communications, they see the map of South Africa as their market and beyond even.
Yes.
And that's okay, because I think if you take the view that green hydrogen and its derivatives is the molecule and of the future for different industries, you do actually need the molecule to be produced at a cost-effective scale everywhere, or where it's applicable. I'm not saying here, there,
Yes.
everywhere. Like, there needs to be like a business sense behind it. So, and the difference is that, and we've also, as the, not we, but the Western Cape government has signed a heads of agreement with the Northern Cape government, because we see that we can
Oh,
be
that's interesting.
complementary actually to each other, because we have a port and a SEZ that is operational, right? So Saldanha can be like your test case of what does it take to produce a green molecule and decarbonize the port, restart ArcelorMittal, maybe even, export at like as a new bunker fuel, and so forth and so forth and so forth.
Yes.
While the Boegoebaai is like greenfield, it's new and its markets are different and at a bigger scale than Saldanha, because Saldanha has the constraint of there's towns around it, and it's not greenfield. So
Yeah.
there's going to be a limit in Saldanha, but eventually, right? But that's okay.
Yes. But I mean, I think what I'm hearing you say, and it's something very interesting, because I'm not sure many people are aware of it, is that Saldanha and Boegoebaai are not potential competitors, because they've got different markets. And whilst Saldanha may be more, I hesitate to use the word parochial, more internally focused, Boegoebaai is clearly an export type project. And the only thing that I wanted to quickly touch base on with you, Thomas, if you could possibly answer this before we get into the Q&A, is you mentioned earlier that, and this actually speaks to a point that Kashifa made about, a confirmed off-taker, and which is critical for the sustainability of this kind of project. We know that, for example, the Namibian project has, in inverted commas, a confirmed off-taker, and that's what makes the project sustainable. But I'm coming back to the point that you made earlier, is that, there may be other jurisdictions that are able to produce hydrogen and do it quicker than we are. But what is long-term in accounts to our favor is the fact that we can produce the energy at a much more cost competitive, and the ultimate product at a much more cost competitive rate. And that means, even though we may not be first mover, doesn't necessarily mean that we miss the market.
Close. What I'm essentially saying is that we've got a very good sun and remarkably good wind. And we are far from some of our markets, not as far as Australia.
Yes.
So that means that Saudi Arabia is better placed than we are. They can, their transport costs are significantly less. They can move things by pipeline. Similarly, Morocco. So what is our competitive advantage? Now, because we can sell the excess electricity to the grid, even if our solar resource is comparable, and even if they may have a better wind resource than us, we might still produce the molecule cheaper. Because what is Saudi Arabia going to do with this excess electricity?
Yes.
What is Morocco going to do with the excess electricity? I can tell you what South Africa will do with the excess electricity. And this now means that excess electricity, you don't even necessarily have to sell it at a profit. You sell the electricity at cost. Yes. Because selling it at cost is a lot better than curtailing it.
Yes.
And because this electricity will be intermittent, right?
Yes.
So therefore, if you're a metro, why must you pay top dollar for electricity that's going to be intermittent. So therefore,
Yeah,
the
yeah.
metro wins because it's at lower cost. If you are, say, the Cape Town Metro, you can use to pump up the pump storage scheme, which then gives greater energy security to the whole region. And there are other benefits that come into play. I mentioned water a little bit earlier. Desalination is an expensive water source, and it's too expensive for agriculture, it's too expensive for poor communities. But the cost of desalination is practically negligible for the hydrogen producer because the costs are dwarfed by the other costs, which means if anyone can afford to build a desalination plant, a hydrogen producer can, which means you can therefore make it as a social license to operate that the desalination plant is oversized. Now, if you are City of Cape Town and you're building a desalination plant for evolutionary expansion, then you know that water will be bought. If you're building a desalination plant for water security as a result of climate change or as a result of intermittent droughts, that's a much harder proposition. And we can see this was faced by Western Australia, it was faced by California. But if you make use of your water security desalination on the back of your hydrogen infrastructure, the hydrogen plant the hydrogen cost is not significantly more, in the order of 1 or 2% more, not much more. You build better buy-in from public stakeholders and from communities, and then it becomes a win-win situation all round. There are multiple linkages that make it interesting.
Thanks. I'm afraid I'm just having an inverter problem myself, so apologies for any beeping noise you may hear in the background. But I'm going to quickly segue into a question just on this point, Thomas, that is in the Q&A. Is one of the participants asked the question: how do you manage intermittent power supply from renewables with hydrogen production process which requires 24/7 power to be efficient?
Right. You don't need 24/7 power, but 24/7 power will certainly make your hydrogen cheaper. Your issue here is that the electricity that you make from solar and wind is going to be cheaper than electricity from the grid. What kills you is that your electrolyzer is expensive. So what you would use is solar and wind together. This means that your sun shines every day. It may not shine well, but it certainly shines, which means that your minimum production in every day of the year is non-zero in good areas. And we have the data to show that. This is not true for wind. Your minimum wind is zero, which means that if you have solar and wind together, by day, you can design a system that's running at near 80% capacity factor. By night, you can be running in the order of 25%, 30% capacity factor. So this together means that your electrolyzer has enough full load hours over the year. That's a technical term implying the rate at which it is used over the year, which means that your hydrogen costs can then come down. Where things get interesting is, let's say you take that hydrogen and you need to make ammonia. Ammonia plants do not like cycling up and down, although an electrolyzer can handle that within limits. And there you must take additional steps. You want a hydrogen storage buffer so that the ammonia plant can run close to 24/7. It still won't run 100% 24/7. And the hydrogen supply is there. And you would want your electricity to be guaranteed, so you probably want a bit of a battery in there as well. But the energy requirement for making ammonia is dwarfed by the energy requirement for the electrolyzer. So when you look at your total economics, that's not a particularly heavy lift. I hope that makes sense.
Thanks, Thomas. It looks like, unfortunately, Matt has dropped off quickly. We'll see if he comes back on. In the meantime, I'm just going to carry on then with the Q&A while we wait for him to join. I'm just going to start at the top because I'm not the expert here. So, oh, there, Matt is back. Matt,
my apologies. Sorry, I had an inverter failure, but at least I have redundancy backup.
No problem.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Well, I just would need to quickly check what the next question is in the in the Q&A. Thank you, Thomas, for the answer, which I didn't completely hear. But let me just quickly check here. So there was a question about renewable energy certificates, the TREX system under REXA, which I'm not sure everybody is aware of. But perhaps I can give a little bit of background for those who are not informed by this. A tradable renewable energy certificate is one that is issued by this organization called the Renewable Energy Council of South Africa, or I think it's Council, I forget. And it effectively certifies that energy produced by a renewable energy facility is green. And typically, we find in the market that the buyer of the electrons is the one who receives that renewable energy certificate, which is then able to be used as a green credit in various forms. The question is, or question posed in the Q&A is, can't a renewable energy certificate be sufficient to demonstrate that the energy used in the production of the hydrogen/ammonia is clean and green? And is there anybody in the panel who can answer the question, in particular in relation to how the European Union approaches this, whether a renewable energy certificate will be sufficient to demonstrate green compliance, or whether we're going to have some kind of islanded solution? Can anybody in the panel venture an answer?
Shahil, do you want to go first?
You can go first, Thomas.
I'm going to give it a stab and say that philosophically, there's no problem why, or there's no reason why renewable certificates should not work. The problems can be more mundane and boring, however, in the sense that you want your electrolyzer to run for a good number of hours. So you want to have a bit of control of the energy supply that comes into it. Unless you've got a long-term agreement with a supplier elsewhere. So you are a large electrolyzer housed in Port A, and there is a large wind farm at site B, and you are buying all of their power by a traded certificate. Then you have an idea of your power per hour, so to speak. But generally speaking, on a spot trading system in the South African environment with low renewable penetration, that could be problematic. The delegated act of the European Union, which I'm not 100% up on, but my understanding was that the European Union, initially the proposal of the Council was that there had to be spatial and temporal correlation for the electricity produced. And initially, everyone was hung up on the definition of spatial and temporal. This delegated act was challenged by the European Parliament, who felt this was too onerous, and the temporal correlation was relaxed to where the electricity is supplied per quarter of the year compared to per hour. Now, my understanding was that that was the state of affairs, but the intent is still to return to spatial, a temporal correlation within an hour. But the spatial correlation theoretically means it's got to be co-located. But in the European Union, this is not true. Co-located just means in the same generating area. Now, Sweden has something like 7 of these generating areas, and France, the whole country, is 1. So you could generate in Perpignan and have an electrolyzer in Dunkirk, and you are still compliant. So I'm at this point, I'll happily hand over to Shahil, because I'm quite sure he will be able to explain better than I did.
Shahil, over to you.
I think you have a better understanding of the EU regulations, but I was just wanted to talk about the opportunities with regards to this. I think utilizing this scheme means that you can use the best resource, which typically would be the Northern Cape for solar and the coastal areas for wind, to power your electrolyzer, which would be located at one of the ports, strategic ports, or even one of the ports that we haven't spoken about. It just allows for this hydrogen economy to kind of touch the entire country rather than being concentrated in very, very specific areas. And I think if we do utilize systems like this, and the EU is happy with this, or any other regulatory body, maybe in Asia or North America, that would be great for the country.
Ugur, as a member of the EU, have you any observations or comments on this? I think it's a 9.
Sorry, I'm here.
No problem.
No, we see as in example, we see so when we talk about EU, we see so many projects, example in this area, and like grow from example to billion euro in 2022 to 2030 by 15 billion euros, and they are planning example of 40 gigawatt of electrolyzer capacities by 2030. And I think it's very important to declare here how they will work or generate this terms and how they want to reach the goal. And I think here is important to work with different solutions like wind or onshore and solar systems. And it is very important to understand when you put these technologies, you work with here with a government together, with safety hazardous areas, etc. You will implement everything and show to the right way to realize this big projects.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Thanks, Ugur. That's really beneficial. Can I ask you this, Thomas, if I may, to circle back to a question around water? You have mentioned some of the issues and constraints, but the question that's raised is, can you actually comment on the actual water requirements, in particular the purity of water that is required for H2 production?
This is a function. You need demineralized water in electrolyzers. And so you are, in any case, if you're using fresh water, surface water, which I would not recommend because we are a water stressed country and so on. But even then, you need to demineralize that water before it goes into the electrolyzer plant. So you are going to have to treat that water anyway. So if your upstream supply is a desalination plant, you are going to end up with a water supply that's in the order, I believe it's 50 ppm for a reverse osmosis system, and significantly lower for a thermal desalination system. But in any case, that will then proceed to a demineralization plant before it goes towards the electrolyzer.
I could just say from my hard experience in a thermal plant that the Demon water process there is still key, even if the benchmark is lower than what you may require for H2 production. But it's still there. But that actually brings to another question that's been asked in the Q&A, and Shahil, maybe you can answer this because of Engie's involvement in the Mogalakwena project. The participant has asked the question, can you unpack a little bit, just from an interest perspective, how that mine wastewater is actually used to be able to produce the hydrogen?
In the simplest way, I think it's exactly what Thomas has just spoken about. You are going to purify the water in specific ways. I think using mine water, there are other chemicals in it, but it's just a different process at the end of the day. You are going to have that demineralization stage right at the end. I think the quality of water does have a slight effect, but again, as Thomas has said before, the desalination / demineralization process is not the biggest driver of the cost of hydrogen.
No, sure. I think the question is more from an interest perspective of how it actually works. So, are you saying though that at, for example, at Mogalakwena, where the wastewater is it scrubbed of the other chemicals, or is it just, you know, it goes through some initial process, then through a demon plant, and then into the electrolyzer?
I'm not too sure about the exact chemistry
Okay.
of this. I can get my chemist to check on this. Provide an
Okay,
answer.
I would imagine you
Yes.
probably are going to have sand filtration upstream, possibly ultrafiltration, moving on to a reverse osmosis step. But you're not dealing with seawater level contamination
No,
of
exactly.
35,000
Yeah.
parts per million. I
Yeah.
would imagine mined water, and again, I stand to be corrected, is in the order of 3,000 parts per million, closer to brackish water.
Yes.
But the principle remains the same. It just means that your filters get clogged less frequently and so on. But you have to worry about hardness. You have to worry about things of that nature. But this is well understood, and is best practice. The professionals know what they're doing. It's not. There's nothing new here. This is understood.
Yeah. Okay. Understood. Thank you, Thomas. There's a question in the Q&A, and I'm going to leave it open to the panel, to one of you to stick up your hand to answer this. And maybe it's you, Thomas, again, because it does go to feasibility. How feasible is it in the shorter term to develop hydrogen projects that integrate sustainable development metrics, or the needs of more marginalized communities versus projects prioritizing decarb and export? So, question of feasibility and sustainability.
Okay. The sustainability, particularly social sustainability, is remarkably important. You would think that it is in contrast to the economic opportunity, but here you need to understand who is the customer. If you are selling the water to, or selling the hydrogen to a local user in an industrial plant, then it's up to the ethics and policies of that plant. If you're selling it to Germany, however, it's a whole new ballgame. The German national hydrogen strategy has got a whole number of elements. For example, the renewable electricity you use to make the hydrogen may not result in a decrease in the renewable energy available to the country. So it must be additional. You may not, therefore, as a result of making the hydrogen, be dispossessing any communities. You must not, and these are all clear. So if you do not qualify, you don't have a market. Germans aren't going to buy it. So therefore, it becomes an economic argument to get your sustainability right. Also, you're operating in the South African context. So you need operating licenses. You are dealing with various regulatory authorities. You're dealing with politicians. And in the South African environment, you're going to struggle to do a large-scale plant without taking sustainability, economics, and so on into effect. Because if your community is against you, if your province is against you, if your government is against you, you are going to struggle.
Thanks, Thomas. Yeah, Kashifi, you had your hand up?
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to just echo what Thomas said. Like, it's actually quite interesting because in these discussions, that is actually up front and center. It's part and parcel of the project definition. It's like, okay, so what is our sustainability approach and a plan?
Yes. Yes, I mean that's an important point, because don't we find that in fact across the sectors, irrespective of the technology and the particular procurement, sustainability and equitable participation in these projects is absolutely key. I mean, otherwise you run the risk of having your plant burnt down, for example. You've got to take communities by the hand and walk the road with them. And that's perhaps an element that is not paid sufficient attention to outside of the formal procurements.
It's not to say that we've got it 100% right in South Africa.
Yeah.
I'm not claiming we are brilliant, but it is not unknown. For example, under the REIPPP, there are communities that that state that they were not sufficiently engaged. So this is a loop. Hopefully, it's a closed loop with actual feedback,
Yes.
and there's actual learning that happens. And that was for electricity supply. But the electricity
Yes.
supply was for the grid. And therefore, you would have certain requirements in the South African framework to go and make this work. You're
Sure.
only dealing with South African stakeholders. When you are selling to the European Union, and particularly to Germany, just to get your contract, you have to go and show all these elements. Your environmental impact assessment isn't just, are you destroying the habitat of a desert turtle or something? You are also saying, are you violating sacred spaces? Are you marginalizing communities? Are you doing all these different things? It's actually part of that study.
Yeah, thanks, Thomas. I think that's an important point to make. And, we are operating in the South African context, and that we have a certain framework that we need to give effect to, irrespective of what the requirements may be for your ultimate, or from your ultimate end user, or the jurisdiction in which your ultimate end user resides. So, I mean, it's important to bear this in mind, is that, we have a certain framework in this country, and it needs to be given effect to. And I asked the question about the smaller player on an advised basis, because, if we don't take communities and players who are not necessarily the big players in the market, if we don't take them in hand and walk the road with them, then there are going to be ultimate challenges way down the line, which kind of you wipe your eyes out and say, well, what was that about? And say, well, you should have paid attention to this 5 years ago. We've kind of reached the end of the questions that are in the Q&A. So I'm going to ask all of the participants. Oh, sorry, Kashifa, you have your hand up.
Sorry, yeah, I mean, the question of local players and participation in this is coming through in the Q&A and in the chat, as you said now. And I think that I want to say that there's a lot of work that is being done by the SETAs on understanding the value chain for the skills that are going to be required at a massive scale. But also I want to say that we do have a hydrogen economy. It's just, I mean, it's only in certain places, and maybe us in the Western Cape don't know anything about it because it's up in Secunda or something, you know what I mean? So we mustn't think that nothing's happening, or that there isn't policies in place for the handling and permitting of hydrogen as a molecule as it is now, right? So I want to say on the local player, and I think what we all know in South Africa is about equity, equality, and transformation.
Yeah.
And so the SETAs are doing quite a lot of work, especially the chemical SETA, right? I mean, this is their market, on the skills value chain analysis for this. Now, that is on the individual level. But if you think about then going into entrepreneurship and local players and small opportunities for smaller players, let me put it that way, then we need to support the SETAs in their skills development work and in their programs, because that will impact the opportunities for players at the small level. So I think I'm keen to see. The other thing I want to say is the green hydrogen commercialization strategy that was worked on and published by the IDC, but it was worked on with the DTIC. So the comment period has closed now, and the teams are busy addressing the comments that were raised. And I'm sure that the localization, the manufacturing, and all of that, and upstream, downstream opportunities is part of those comments that were submitted. So I'm keen to see what that strategy looks like after the comments. And I think that we need to, on platforms like this, actually make sure that we communicate what those strategies are saying to the relevant audiences.
I think that's such an important point, the communication, because if we're not communicating, then people feel left behind, and then the only way to ventilate their frustration or their exercise their participation is to make noise. And we want to facilitate the process, not to have it full of roadblocks and interruptions. Thanks for that, Kashifa. I'm going to take that. You'll forgive me, as a reformed litigator, I'm going to take that as your final submission, and I'm going to ask the rest of the participants or panelists to make their final submissions before I adjourn and take this under advisement. So do any of you have any final comments? Thomas?
I'll give a quick comment here and say that there's been a lot of talk about hydrogen, and the issue is hydrogen is a commodity which has value depending on the local market which exists. So if the very green market is in Germany, then you've got to be very compliant and get it to Germany. An emerging market is sustainable maritime fuel. And that's what's interesting there, is that the ship comes to you. You're not trying to sell it in Rotterdam. That means you're competing with the port up the way. You're not competing with Santiago in Chile or with places in Australia. And that then means that you have a local market. Hydrogen is ultimately a local commodity because you incur cost when you transport it. So you can make it at higher cost, closer to where the client needs it, and still have a market compared to making it at low cost in bulk at the port, and still then have to transport it overland to your customer inland. So it's a complex interplay of understanding what is your cost of production, what is your cost of transport, and where is your customer, how much does he want, and how does he want it? And that's possibly what scares some folk, because you've got to keep all this in your head at the same time, which is why it's good to develop a team.
Yeah. Thanks, Thomas. Shahil, Ugo, any final comments?
I think we need to understand that the hydrogen economy, especially in South Africa is rife with opportunities. And I think we can see from this panel, there is interest from all different sectors. And it's quite comforting to knowing that there is this interest in creating value for the country, creating value for the world, and doing something about climate change at the end of the day. And I think that's where the excitement of green hydrogen really lies.
Thank you. Thanks, Sachin. Ugo? I'm in the same opinion like Thomas. Example for the producing hydrogen in a local form, and not to deliver some from one location to other location because of the cost. But if you have a chance, like standing in Europe, or you're producing your hydrogen in Norway or UK, over pipelines, you can calculate it whether it is okay or not. I see Morocco as a good way between Spain or to produce hydrogen in Morocco and deliver example over pipelines to Europe. And this is some opportunities for us. But I see in the future we can learn and see more and more options and opportunities about these applications.
Thanks, Ugo. That's great. Thank you very much for all of the participants or panelists for your participation and inputs. Shannon, so I'm going to hand back to you because we are, in fact, on the hour.
Thanks very much, Matt. With all of that said, that does bring us to the end of our webinar. I'd like to take this opportunity to say thank you to our facilitator, Matt Ash, for enabling an engaging discussion. Thank you also to our panelists, Thomas Roos from the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research, Kashifa Björkes from Freeport Saldanha, Ugo Unal from Stahl, and Shahil Jagannath from ENGIE. Thank you also to our sponsors, that's Stahl, the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research, Enetrach, ENGIE, HISA Infrastructure, Norton Rose Fulbright, Oxyon People Solutions, RTS Africa, and Ukwazi for their support in making this webinar possible. And finally, thank you to the attendees for taking the time to join us for this discussion on the policies to expand investment in green hydrogen as a new clean energy source. We hope you found this event engaging and informative. Our next webinar takes place on the 10th of May at 2 p.m, where we'll be discussing local manufacturing. The link to register for that event has been shared in the chat, and we'll also communicate it in a follow-up email. The recording of today's webinar will be sent to you in due course, and if you have any additional questions, please be in touch. You can reach us at shannon@creamermedia.co.za. Thank you so much for your time, and goodbye.
Thank you, Shannon. Thanks, everybody.